Okay, awesome. Hey everyone, I'm Kyle Chard. I think many of you here. It's great to see such a big group of people attending our fourth community summit. I was tasked yesterday with joining Dan to lead the breakout discussion on specifications, standards, and APIs. So in the spirit of reuse and interoperability, rather than write our own motivation slide, we went and looked back at the previous community summits and borrowed the motivation slide used by Doug in the first community summit more than a year ago now, I think. And I think many of these types of community events and workflows start with a similar sort of story, right? I mean, Raphael mentioned this in his introduction. There's 300 and I can't remember the number, 24 systems, workflow systems that are listed on the CWL managed web page on GitHub repo. And I think to users, many of these workflow systems perform relatively similar things. And so Doug had this nice sort of characterization here about why does the workflow landscape look the way it does? And I think as Doug, I completely agree with what he said here. There are some valid underlying reasons for divergence when you think about the user communities and the ways in which different users like to express workflows down to the resources on which those workflows are running, that inherently those resources and the optimization goals that are expressed in the actual workflows can be quite different. The types of workflows and the scales of workflows, the types of tasks they're orchestrating, et cetera, can be quite different. But in saying that, there's also a lot of overlap between these systems, and there's really some fairly, in our opinion, fairly significant opportunities where we could work together, where we could reuse bits and pieces of other workflow systems, build upon other workflow systems, make it easier for people to be able to move workflows between different systems, et cetera. So if we think about why are we focused on specifications, standards, and APIs, the three quick reasons we came up with, I'm sure there are many others. The first is to reduce overheads. So at the moment, the software stack and sort of workflows is quite monolithic. If you look at these 324 systems, there's probably very little reuse, very little sharing between these systems, and probably a lot of duplication. And while it might not be duplication at the sort of entire stack level, there are certainly components that look pretty similar between these workflow systems. For example, how we deal with resources on which we're executing things, how we manage DAGs, how we monitor execution, how we capture provenance, et cetera. If we're able to sort of standardize or develop shared specifications or APIs that can be reused, we can reduce many of the overheads that we all incur in terms of development, testing, maintenance, et cetera. We can build upon other components that are potentially more robust, so we benefit from the community's efforts, I guess, to make more reliable, robust, performant underlying capabilities. We can increase portability, as the slide previously said, such that we can move more easily between different resources. We can keep up with the explosion in terms of hardware heterogeneity, schedulers, clouds, et cetera. A second one, which has been really motivating for our work over the last few years, is around improving user experience. I think, and if I look around the room here today, I think overwhelmingly the people on this community summit today represent workflow system developers more than workflow users. And when we talk to workflow users, they really face a pretty significant challenge when they look at this ecosystem of many seemingly comparable workflow systems with different sort of interfaces, different ways of actually doing things. So that the challenge for users to be able to pick up these tools, be able to map them to problems, be able to move between different tools. So for instance, a user might start with an application that's very well, or a workflow that's very well lined up with a particular workflow system. The next time they need to develop a workflow, they often will stick with the workflow system they've previously used, just because the inertia, the cost to move to another workflow system is significant, even if the workflow itself may have completely different characteristics that would potentially benefit from another workflow system itself. So what we'd like to think about is establishing more of an ecosystem of complementary capabilities of workflow systems, bits and pieces that can work together, enable sharing, and ultimately improve user experience. And I think the first step towards this goal is these types of gatherings where we all come together and at least discuss where we could be improving and working together. And then the final thing we thought about is actually enabling innovation. So as workflow system developers, I guess our interest is on innovating. It's about doing interesting things, about developing and meeting these new use cases that are coming down the pipe from the applications, from the scientists that we're working with, from the users we're working with. So by enabling sort of sharing, enabling interoperability, reuse via specifications, standards, APIs, it enables us to focus on the more novel, interesting stuff at a higher level of the workflow stack without potentially reproducing things at the lower level. When we think about where we could be looking at sort of sharing interoperability specifications, APIs, there are many layers of workflow systems. And so this is a quick list of places we could potentially think about. I don't want to say the word standardizing, but sort of sharing, or I'm trying to avoid saying the word standardize, because I think standards are somewhat irrelevant in the scheme of things here, because really what we care about is sort of common approaches that are adopted by the community. I think a small body of people deciding on a standard doesn't really help us. It's really about what the community sort of decides and comes together and what gathers momentum. So in terms of levels, I think we've seen some great success at some of the higher levels around workflow representations. We've seen some good progress in the lower levels around how we speak to sort of resources and execution. Perhaps in the middle, less standardization, less commonality around how we monitor, how we manage, how we schedule workflows, how we capture provenance, et cetera. And one of the tasks I think today we should think about which levels are appropriate for sort of common specifications, common sharing, and how we should prioritize those levels for work in the community. In terms of where we are at the moment and focus today, so as I said, we want to identify which layers would benefit from common specifications. As I said, we've seen great success in workflow specifications when you think about CWL, WDL, et cetera. We want to gather a set of current specifications, APIs, components that are being used. So examples of APIs, capabilities, things like Condor, which is widely used as an execution framework for workflow systems, Saga, SciJ, which are used to abstract speaking to schedulers. And importantly, we want to understand the process by which these specifications have been created, how they've been adopted, how they've evolved, because I think that's perhaps even more important than the actual technical contributions. In the previous roadmaps, as I said before, so we've seen that workflow systems differ by design. They have many layers and components that could be interchangeable, could be interoperable if we did a little bit of extra work to enable some sort of common way of expressing those interfaces. One quick example from in the last year is the ExaWorks group, which is a sort of cross DOE project that combines, I think, 4 national laboratories and many others, set about an effort to try and think about how we can break down some of the barriers of the workflow systems used in the DOE. After speaking with many of the workflow systems and users, we identified sort of the lowest level, how we actually speak to these DOE computing systems as being a piece of the workflow stack that could be made more common across these systems, because everyone basically had their own implementation. Of course, we look back and we saw that previous efforts with things like Saga and Drama had been developed and had been successful in some way or another, but we saw an opportunity here, particularly around the Python-based workflow systems that were becoming increasingly pervasive in DOE. So as part of this project, we set about a community-oriented sort of process for defining a specification and a reference implementation. We had open meetings, we had open GitHub sort of development of the specification, where we had great input from the community in terms of issues and ideas that they'd like to see incorporated. We as a community have created an initial Python implementation for this, and we're actually starting to see adoption. I think there's now about 4 workflow systems that can speak the SciJ language to actually be able to coordinate resource provisioning with underlying resources. So I'll finish just with again a highlight of the topics we want to discuss in today's breakout. And I should say this is not exhaustive. We welcome people to join the breakout and suggest other things we should be talking about. So as I said, what levels of the workflow stack would benefit from specifications? What are the success stories so far that we see out there in the community at different layers? What are the processes that we should be going through to create these types of specifications? How can we maintain them? How can we gain adoption? What are the challenges that have impeded creation of common specifications, and particularly adoption of them? Because I think there's probably no shortage of specifications that have been created. And then the million-dollar question of how far are we from defining actual standards for some aspects of this problem space. With that, I'm done. Any questions?